My granddaughter Emma is 19 years old, and she has never once asked me how much money I have. This is not unusual. Most 19-year-olds do not ask their grandmothers about money. What is unusual is the conclusion Emma reached without asking. She reached it gradually, the way young people reach conclusions about older relatives, through observation and assumption, and the particular confidence of someone who has never been wrong about something long enough to develop doubt. She concluded that I was poor. Not struggling, not careful with money, poor. She told her brother this. Her brother told his girlfriend. The girlfriend apparently mentioned it to Emma's mother, Nicole, who did not correct her because Nicole had her own reasons for not correcting her. I knew about all of it. I had known for 4 months. I had said nothing. Not because I was hurt, not because I was planning a response, because I was curious how far it would go before someone thought to simply ask me. The answer, it turned out, was a graduation dinner at a restaurant that cost $412, and I paid for all of it. With a card that made the waiter's eyes go very still for just a moment before he composed himself and said, "Of course, Mrs. Brooks, right away." My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old. I live in Connecticut. I taught high school English for 22 years. I have one son, Lucas, and 2 grandchildren, Emma, who is 19, and her brother Daniel, who is 17. I want to say something clearly before I go further. I am not a wealthy woman in the way that word is used when people mean something extraordinary. I am not a woman with a yacht or a second home in Italy or a portfolio that requires a team of people to manage. What I am is a woman who has been careful for 40 years, who saved consistently from the first paycheck of her first real job and never stopped, who paid off this house in 18 years instead of 30 because I made additional principal payments every month from the year Lucas started school, who drove the same car for 11 years because it worked and because the money I did not spend on a new car went somewhere more useful. Richard and I built something quiet and solid over 31 years. When he died, I inherited a fully paid house, a life insurance policy, and an investment portfolio that Margaret, my accountant, had helped us build across 2 decades of disciplined monthly contributions. Richard had been an engineer. He had approached our finances with the same systematic attention he brought to structural problems. Nothing flashy, nothing that required explanation or justification. Just consistent, careful compounding. I have never told my grandchildren any of this, not from secrecy, from the understanding that money discussed too early and too specifically does strange things to the people who hear about it. I had seen it in the children of wealthy friends, the particular softness that develops in young people who know they have a net beneath them before they have learned to walk the wire. I did not want that for Emma and Daniel, so I said nothing. I drove a modest car. I wore good clothes that I kept for years. I cooked at home most evenings. I did not take expensive vacations or redecorate rooms that did not need redecorating. I lived in the way I had always lived, carefully, comfortably, without announcement. And Emma watched this and reached her conclusion. I first understood what she believed 4 months ago at a Sunday dinner at Lucas and Nicole's apartment. Nicole had suggested a restaurant for Lucas's birthday. A good restaurant, the kind that requires a reservation made 3 weeks in advance, and where the menu has no prices on the version given to certain guests. She had mentioned it casually at the end of the previous Sunday dinner, and had added, with the particular careful lightness of someone choosing their words, "Of course we want to make sure everyone is comfortable with the cost." Everyone in that sentence meant me. I said, "It sounds lovely, book it." Nicole said, "Are you sure? We could always do something simpler." I said, "Book the restaurant, Nicole." She booked it. But the seed had been planted in the room, and Emma had been present to receive it. I saw the look that passed between Emma and Daniel, the quick, sideways glance of 2 young people who have just received confirmation of something they already believed. After that, I began to notice the adjustments. Small ones, the kind that are invisible unless you are looking for them. Emma stopped mentioning things she wanted when I asked what she might like for her birthday. She said, "Oh, anything, Grandma, something small. I don't need much." Daniel, who had previously sent me enthusiastic lists of books and equipment for his photography hobby, began saying, Honestly, Grandma, whatever you feel comfortable with. Whatever you feel comfortable with. The phrase of a young person who has been told, or has concluded, that asking too much would be a burden. Nicole began occasionally offering to split costs at family dinners. Not consistently, just enough to establish a posture. A gesture that said, "We are aware of your situation." My situation. I let all of it accumulate. Not with bitterness, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that the most informative thing you can do when people reveal their assumptions is to wait and see what those assumptions produce. 4 months of assumptions. And then Emma graduated from her first year of college. Lucas proposed a celebration dinner. He named a restaurant, a good one, not the most expensive in the city, but solidly in the category of places where the bill for 8 people does not leave anyone indifferent. Emma said, "Dad, maybe somewhere a bit more casual? For everyone's sake." For everyone's sake. I said nothing. Lucas said, "Emma, this is your celebration. We're doing it properly." Emma looked at me across the table with the careful eyes of a young woman trying to protect someone she loves from a cost she has decided that person cannot absorb. I looked back at her. I said, "I'm looking forward to it." She said, "Grandma, really, it doesn't have to be." I said, "Emma, I am looking forward to it." She smiled the smile of someone who has decided to let the matter rest while privately resolving to handle the situation herself later. I had been watching her learn to manage me for 4 months. I was curious how the management would look at a celebration dinner for 8. If you have ever been underestimated by someone you love, stay with me. Because what happened at that dinner is something worth hearing completely. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. I post every week. The dinner was on a Saturday in June. 8 of us. Lucas and Nicole, Emma and her boyfriend Marcus, who was 20 and studying engineering, and who had the particular careful politeness of a young man meeting his girlfriend's grandmother in a good restaurant and wanting to make a correct impression. Daniel and his friend Theo, who had been invited because they were inseparable and because Lucas believed celebrations should be generous. And me. The restaurant was exactly what Lucas had chosen it to be. White tablecloths, a wine list presented in a leather folder, servers who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who have been trained to be present without being intrusive. The kind of place that makes a room feel like an occasion without requiring the occasion to justify itself. We were seated at a round table in a corner that gave us privacy without isolation. Emma sat across from me. She looked beautiful. Her first year of college had given her something, a particular quality of having been tested and found capable that sits differently on a young person than ordinary confidence. She had studied hard. She had managed herself in a city away from her family for the first time. She had done it well, and she knew it, and the knowledge was becoming her in the way that earned things become people. I was proud of her. I was also watching her. The menus came. The kind without prices on certain copies. I had been correct about that. Emma received one of those copies. I received the standard menu. I noticed Emma glance at mine and then look away. She was already calculating. The first adjustment came when the server asked about starters. Emma said, "I think I'll just have the soup. Something light." The soup was the least expensive starter by a margin that was not accidental. Daniel said, "I'm having the carpaccio." "Emma, you should get the—" Emma said, "The soup sounds perfect, actually." Marcus said nothing. He was watching Emma with the expression of a young man who has been briefed and is following instructions. The second adjustment came with the mains. Emma chose the pasta, the third, least expensive option on the menu. She said it with a brightness that was slightly too deliberate, the brightness of someone performing a preference they do not entirely feel. Nicole watched all of this with the expression of someone who has some responsibility for the situation and is not entirely comfortable with how it is developing. Lucas was oblivious. He was talking to Daniel about a film they had both seen and ordering the steak with the uncomplicated appetite of a man who is celebrating his daughter's achievement and has not noticed the choreography happening across the table. I ordered the duck. Emma looked at my menu choice and then looked at her own plate. I said, "Emma, Tell me about the year. The real version, not the summary. And she did. For 40 minutes, she told me about her professors and her dormitory and the friend she had made in October who had become the kind of friend you recognize immediately as significant. She told me about the class that had surprised her, an economics seminar she had taken as a requirement and found unexpectedly absorbing. She told me about the paper she had written in April that her professor had asked her to submit to a student journal. She was luminous talking about it. This is the thing about Emma that the 4 months of careful management had not obscured. She is genuinely remarkable. The quality of her mind when she is not performing consideration for someone else is one of the best things I know. I watched her and I thought, she has spent 4 months protecting me from a cost that does not exist. She has been shrinking her own celebration to spare me a bill I could pay 14 times without looking at the account afterward. The meal progressed. The wine was ordered. Lucas chose a bottle that was good without being excessive, and I noted Emma watching the price, and then watching me, and then composing her face into the expression of someone who has decided not to say anything. Dessert menus came. Emma said, "I'm fine, actually. No dessert for me." Daniel said, "Emma, it's your graduation dinner." Emma said, "I'm full, really. Please, everyone order what they want. Don't worry about me. Don't worry about me." The particular phrase of someone who is doing all of the worrying on behalf of everyone else. I said, "Emma, order the dessert." She said, "Grandma, honestly." I said, "The chocolate fondant. Order it. It's your dinner." She looked at me. I held her gaze with the particular steadiness that 62 years and a great deal of practice produces. She ordered the chocolate fondant. When the bill came, the server placed it in the center of the table, in the neutral position of someone who has been trained not to assume. Lucas reached for it. I said, "Lucas, I have this." He said, "Mom, you don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to. I want to. It's Emma's dinner." I took the leather folder. I looked at the total. $412, including service. I placed my card inside and handed it back to the server. The server opened the folder, looked at the card, and his eyes went very still for just a moment. Not long, a professional fraction of a second. Then he composed himself completely and said, "Of course, Mrs. Brooks. Right away." Emma was watching. She had seen the server's expression. She looked at the card in the folder as the server walked away, and then she looked at me with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. She said, "Grandma, what card is that?" I said, "My card." She said, "Which account?" I said, "My investment account." Margaret set up a card connected to it years ago. It's more practical for larger purchases. Emma said, "Your investment account." I said, "Yes." She said, "You have an investment account." I said, "I have several." The table was very quiet. Nicole looked at the tablecloth. Lucas looked at me with the expression of a son who has just understood that his mother has been watching something develop for 4 months and has chosen this precise moment to provide the complete picture. Emma said, "Grandma, how long have you—" I said, 40 years, give or take." She said, "But you never, you drive that car and you—" I said, "I drive that car because it works. I kept my clothes because good things last. I cooked at home because I like cooking. None of those things are evidence of what you decided they were evidence of, Emma." She said, "I thought you were—" I said, "I know what you thought." She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at my granddaughter across the white tablecloth of a restaurant that had just confirmed something she had spent 4 months believing incorrectly. I said, "Because I wanted to see what you would do with the assumption." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Perhaps not, but it was instructive. If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever been the person who was underestimated and chose to say nothing, leave me a comment. Tell me what you saw while you were waiting. I read every single one." The server returned the card and the receipt with the professional composure of someone who has seen many things at many tables and has learned to carry all of them with equal neutrality. I signed the receipt. I placed the card back in my wallet. The table had the particular quality of stillness that follows the arrival of significant information in a public setting. The stillness of people who are processing something and are aware that they are in a restaurant and that the processing needs to wait until a more appropriate location. Emma was looking at her chocolate fondant with the focused attention of someone who needs something to look at that is not a face. Marcus was looking at Emma. Daniel had the expression of a 17-year-old who has just understood that the adults at this table have been playing a game he did not know was being played and who is not certain whether to find this fascinating or unsettling. Theo was eating his dessert with the diplomatic focus of a guest who understands that certain things are not his business. Nicole said, "The food was wonderful." It was the sentence of a woman deploying ordinary conversation as a bridge across extraordinary territory. I appreciated the effort, even as I recognized it for what it was. Lucas said, "Yes, really excellent." We finished dessert. We collected coats. We stood outside in the June evening where the city had the particular warm quality of a Saturday night that has not yet decided to become Sunday. Lucas hugged Emma and said he was proud of her. Daniel punched her lightly on the shoulder, which was his version of the same sentiment. Marcus shook Lucas's hand and said thank you for dinner with the good manners of a young man who had recovered his footing. Emma hugged me last. She held on for a moment longer than a standard goodbye hug. She said quietly into my shoulder, "I feel like an idiot." I said, "You're not an idiot. You made an assumption and you acted on it with consideration. The consideration was genuine, even if the assumption was wrong." She pulled back and looked at me. She said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said, "Would you have believed me?" She thought about it. She said, "Probably not right away." I said, "No, probably not. Some things need to be shown rather than told." She said, "That's very calculated of you, Grandma." I said, "I prefer the word patient." She almost laughed. I said, "Come for coffee tomorrow, just you and me." She said, "Yes, I'll be there at 10. She was there at 9:50. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the particular quality of a morning after a significant evening, the quietness of two people who have already said the large things and are now in the territory of what comes after. Emma wrapped both hands around her mug in the way she has done since she was 6 years old and first started drinking hot chocolate at this table. She said, "Can I ask you things?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The investment accounts, how many?" I said, 3, plus the property, plus a pension from 30 years of teaching that I have not needed to touch. She said, "And you never said anything." I said, "I never said anything to you specifically. Lucas knows the broad shape of it, not the specifics, those are mine, but the broad shape." She said, "Does Nicole know?" I said, "Nicole knows what Lucas knows, which is that I am not in need of financial support." Emma said, "She let me think you were struggling." I said, "Nicole has her own relationship to questions about my finances. That is between Nicole and me." Emma accepted this. She was learning. I could see it. The particular adult understanding that some things belong to the people directly involved and are not general family information. She said, "The card. The investment account card. I've never seen you use it." I said, "I don't use it often. Margaret set it up for occasions where cash or a standard card is less practical. I have used it perhaps a dozen times in 10 years. She said, "Why last night?" I looked at her. I said, "Because you spent 4 months ordering soup instead of what you actually wanted. Because you told your brother whatever you feel comfortable with when he asked what to get you for your birthday. Because you said, 'Don't worry about me' at your own graduation dinner. And because I thought it was time for you to have accurate information before another 4 months passed." Emma looked at her coffee. She said, "I was trying to take care of you." I said, "I know." She said, "That's what I thought I was doing." I said, "I know that too. And I want to say something about it that I mean completely. The instinct to take care of people you love is one of the best things about you, Emma. The problem was not the instinct. The problem was that you acted on an assumption instead of a conversation. If you had asked me directly 4 months ago, I would have told you the truth directly. The assumption was the mistake, not the caring. She said, "Why didn't I just ask?" I said, "I've been thinking about that. I think because asking felt rude, like it was impolite to ask a grandmother about money. And I think that politeness, that particular kind of careful avoidance, was more comfortable than the possibility of an answer that might be difficult." She said, "But the answer wasn't difficult." I said, "No." "But you didn't know that." She said, "So I protected myself from a difficult answer that didn't exist by spending 4 months treating you like you were fragile." I said, "That is a very precise summary." She said, "That's embarrassing." I said, "It's human. The embarrassing things usually are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandma, the accounts, the property, when you—" She stopped. She started again. "When things change, is there a plan?" I said, "There is a very thorough plan prepared by my attorney and reviewed every 2 years. It does not require your input at this stage, and it will not surprise you when it becomes relevant." She said, "That's a very precise way of saying it's handled." I said, "It is handled, yes." She said, "Okay." She said it with the particular exhale of a young person who has been carrying a weight they invented and has just been told they can put it down. I said, "Emma, I want you to do something for me going forward." She said, "Anything." I said, "When you have a question about something that concerns me, ask me directly. Not your father, not Nicole, me. I will tell you what I am willing to tell you, and I will tell you clearly when something is not your business. But I would rather have the direct conversation than watch you spend months organizing your behavior around something you imagined." She said, "That's fair." I said, "It is fair, and it is considerably more efficient." She smiled. A real one this time, the full Emma smile that had been rationed across 4 months of careful management and was now simply present at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the coffee and the June light coming through the window. She said, "Can I ask what you actually wanted for your birthday this year?" I said, "The good olive oil, the Italian one from the shop on Elm Street. I've wanted it for 6 months and kept telling myself it was unnecessary." She said, "That's $22. I said, "It's very good olive oil." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine amusement rather than from the performance of being fine. I poured us both more coffee. It is Monday morning. The olive oil arrived yesterday afternoon. Emma had driven to the shop on Elm Street after she left my house on Sunday, and she texted me a photograph of it on my doorstep with a note that said, "For a woman who has everything and wanted this." I put it in the kitchen, and I used it last night on a salad, and it was exactly as good as I had expected. Emma starts her 2nd year of college in September. She called yesterday evening, not about anything specific, just to talk. We spoke for 40 minutes about her economics seminar and a book she was reading, and whether she should adopt a plant for her dormitory room. I said, "Get the plant, something that doesn't require too much attention, but that you will notice is there." She said, "Like a succulent?" I said, "Like a succulent." She said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes, genuinely." She said, "Good, that's the main thing." She is 19 years old, and she is learning that the main thing is indeed the main thing. I did not correct her assumption for 4 months. I let her order soup and say, "Don't worry about me," and shrink her own celebration by careful degrees. I watched what the assumption produced. I waited for the right moment. The right moment cost $412, and a server whose eyes went still for just one professional fraction of a second. It was worth every penny. Some lessons cannot be told. They have to be shown, at a white tablecloth on a Saturday evening in June, with a card that makes a waiter pause. And sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone you love is let them be wrong long enough to understand why. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever underestimated you and you chose to say nothing? Tell me what you were waiting for. Tell me what happened when you finally let them see the truth. I read every single one. And if this story reached you today, subscribe, because the next one will stay with you too.